Hello, my name is Dr. Isabel Zog, and today I'll be presenting Language Justice in the Digital Sphere, Machine Translation in African Languages. I'm pleased to be here with you today. A little bit about myself. I have a PhD in communication from American University. I have made Ethiopia my research focus and home as a two-time Fulbright Fellow. I focused on the Ethiopic script, which you can see in the upper picture, and the languages that use it in Ethiopia and Eritrea, looking at grassroots efforts to create digital capacity and the current vitality of the script in the digital sphere. I was also part of the leadership team for the Global Language Justice Mellon Sawyer Seminar at Columbia University, and currently develop, teach, and assess cross-disciplinary data science curriculum, including through an NIH project in partnership with Addis Ababa University and University of Nairobi. The aims of my presentation are to introduce you to the topic of language justice in the digital sphere and look at how machine translation in particular is shaped by power in terms of the technologies that fuel it, the language hierarchies that it represents, and the translation that is happening within it. I want to focus also on digital systems and how they affect the lives of speaker communities, the challenges of developing machine translation for digitally disadvantaged languages, the promise of this technology, as well as the perils. So I've developed a three-pronged framework to define language justice in the digital sphere. The first prong is equitable access, which argues that language communities around the world should have access to digital tools that serve their language needs. The second is language and script integrity, which argues that the tools that we develop should help further languages and scripts rather than degrade their use and degrade the integrity of their grammars and the cultural aspects communicated within them. And the third is digital justice, which argues that these tools should also basically enhance the lives of the users versus degrading them. So let's first think about whether language technology, whether we can say it has politics, right? How do we think about tools that seem to be quite objective and neutral and how they shape power in our world? So I give the example of park benches in the upper photo, which have an armrest in the middle. These are designed so that homeless people cannot sleep on them. So they're designed to serve certain types of park goers, whereas other types of park goers are, basically engineered out of their preferred use of these benches. And so we need to realize that tools in their design, be it intentionally like this park bench or unintentionally, they have winners and losers, people who can use them in the ways they prefer and people who struggle to use them or may be excluded from their use. And that's important as we look at digital technologies, which are very much shaped by rhetoric by big companies. So on the lower right, we see a Facebook advertisement from early on, where Facebook argues that it is bringing the world closer together, building community, and it compares itself to chairs. And, when we think about the park benches, we could think as chairs, as neutral as they may seem, as universal, actually are shaped by power, and not everyone can use a chair in the same way. And as we think about language and how that complicates how digital tools bring the world together, we can look at research such as Cornai's 2013 work that proposes that 95% of languages will not attain digital vitality. Unicode's president, Mark Davis, estimates that 98% of languages are digitally disadvantaged, and he's someone who worked at Google for many years. And we see some of these politics and tensions around language playing out in the news regularly. So last year we saw news articles about Facebook's inability to grapple with the language diversity in India and how that their inability to keep up with content moderation was negatively impacting the country. We've seen similar types of articles about Ethiopia, about Nigeria. This is a worldwide program or a worldwide problem. And we also saw Frances Haugen's whistleblower reports noting that over 80% of content moderation resources at Facebook were focused on North America and English language content, right? So we're seeing there is an imbalance in terms of who are the communities being served by these tools. So I want to go a little bit more fundamental here for a moment and make sure we're clear on the basics. So when it comes to language and script, there are 6,000 to 8,000 languages in the world. Now, why this fuzzy number? Well, it's often difficult to distinguish between a language and a dialect. And there's a great quote that a language is actually a dialect with an army and navy. So again, power is very much at play in how we define even what makes a language community. We also have to acknowledge that globally, most people speak more than one language. And we have a few languages that are spoken by a large number of people in the world, whereas we have a large number of languages that are spoken by a very small percentage of our global population. And then we need to differentiate between languages and the scripts or the written characters that they're written in. There are about 300 scripts in use in the world, historic as well as actively used scripts. And languages and scripts do not have a one-to-one or static relationship. So we have here on the right a picture of a storefront in Azerbaijan. You can see words written in the Latin script, the Cyrillic script, and the Arabic script, all communicating the same messages. And so this is a dynamic relationship, and often script changes over time based on the politics of a government or a nation state. We also have to acknowledge that many languages are oral. So more than half of our languages may have a writing system, but in many cases it is not widely used. And in some cases there is not a writing system for some languages. Now, it's also important to point out that linguists predict 50 to 90% of languages across the world risk extinction this century. And this is quite concerning to many. It even dwarfs the rates of biodiversity extinction. And so we have to wonder what is happening to our languages. And we also have to note that scripts are also being abandoned. There are also emerging and new scripts being developed. But in many places, actually the Latin or the Roman script is being taken on to replace or to become the first writing system for many languages, which also has geopolitical consequences and relationships to the digital sphere, where that script in particular has been a default. So why are languages and scripts, why are we seeing such shifts towards extinction? Well, we see historical realities such as colonization and imperial reach. We see histories of evangelization and the spread of religions and religious texts, as well as logics of alphabetic superiority, where Western countries in particular argued that the Latin alphabet is the most elegant and advanced alphabet, and some have made the argument that the few characters that are used, they fit on the keyboard so nicely. This is the best script. And again, this is informed by kind of cultural and racial superiority notions, which other scholars have argued fiercely against. We see patterns of urbanization where people are leaving behind mother tongues and teaching their kids rather national and globally dominant languages in cities. And climate and ecosystem catastrophes are also often pushing people off of their traditional lands. And we also see oppression where many language communities are not allowed to speak their language in public. Their children are not allowed to learn their language. And then last, and this was my interest as a communication scholar, was how are digital technologies playing into these patterns? So we do see these kind of language hierarchies in the digital sphere, just as we see in the wider world. So while we see, for example, Chinese is the language that's most spoken globally, it represents only a small fraction of digital content, whereas English makes up a large fraction. So why do we see this? Why do we see QWERTY keyboards shown here on the right as the default keyboard countries across the world, even in places that don't use the Latin script widely? Well, this goes back to historical reasons. So, hardware and software historically was developed by Much of it was developed in Western countries, and it's still built largely with English and Latin script defaults. And we also see a market logic of big tech companies in that it's not to their financial benefit to actually support the languages and scripts of less wealthy or large communities. And so while we see, an increasing level of language diversity in the digital sphere, it's still quite imbalanced. And we see some growth. This image shows you 2012 to 2015. We see some growth in the number of languages supported by major platforms, but in many cases, it's not a very swift growth. And when we consider that we have, maybe close to 7,000 languages in use, even Google, which has done probably one of the better jobs of supporting multiple languages, there are hundreds of languages supported, still dwarfs that number. And so many, including myself, have pointed out that this may actually be contributing, this lack of support in the digital sphere may be contributing to language extinction widely. So why should we care? Well, the theme of this conference is the loss of knowledge for sustainable societies. And I think it's really important to think about how language extinction can play into this. For language communities, a loss of a language can mean the degradation of intergenerational cohesion, culture, and well-being. And for humankind, we lose all the knowledge that's stored in people's memories, which is much greater than that which is stored in books or databases. And we see a great extinction of ideas, ways of knowing, wisdom, and solutions for future problems that would traditionally be passed down orally, but that passing down is often broken when languages are not passed on to the next generation. Now, with digital language extinction, especially for young people, when they're not able to use their language with digital tools, slowly they lose function in their language. So they're not as fluent in it. And they also note that their language is not prestigious. It doesn't hold a rank on this kind of hierarchy of languages in the world. And so for young people in particular, that gives them the message that their language is not important. And slowly, as they're not using their language for text messaging and the like, they can lose competence. And this is happening also with scripts. And this is how language extinction is also in part being fueled by digital technologies. So what would ideally be the situation if we would like to support all the languages of the world? Well, technologists call this full stack support. So this at a foundational level means Unicode support. Unicode allows people to exchange messages interoperably in all of the scripts and characters used across the world. Currently, it includes 161 scripts with another approximately 150 scripts still in the pipeline. Next, you need fonts, you need keyboards so people can input their language. And you need then support in major software platforms. And then down the ladder, you would need NLP tools such as machine translation. And that's going to be the focus of my talk from here on. Let's see. So what about machine translation? You may hear about it in the news or in your own work. So this is a subsection of natural language processing. Recently, we've seen a shift from purely statistical approaches to neural or AI approaches to machine translation, which are opening up new possibilities, including zero-shot translation. So in terms of the history of machine translation, much of its early efforts were fueled by the Cold War cryptography movement. So a lot of the work in MT was funded by military intelligence efforts, but it was harder than predicted. And to this day, we see a lot of funding coming from intelligence and defense actors. And some of that money flows to university researchers who are at the forefront of this field, but we also see corporate actors increasingly making strides in this area. Now, within machine translation, technologists define languages as either high resource, and these are typically the colonial or imperial languages of the wealthiest nations in the world, medium resource, and low resource. And so even though many of these low resource languages may be spoken by tens of millions of people, they have not had the investment in developing all of the corpora, all of the tools to actually develop machine translation for these languages. And so we see these hierarchies of power and wealth mapped onto the digital sphere. And even within low resource languages, we see distinctions between the standard low resource languages, which do have at least some written materials, versus the impoverished low resource languages, which may actually be oral languages that have very few written resources to begin with. So Google Translate has made many slides, many strides in this area. So they now support 133 languages, representing about, representing 17% of African languages covered, although around 33% of all of the world's languages are actually African. So we can still see that African languages are not, statistically represented by Google Translate, although they recently added 10 new, so that has really expanded the set. I want to give just a quick snapshot of a few African languages. One is Tamazight. It's a national language of Morocco, and it's considered nothing near extinct. It's flourishing, but nonetheless, it has no Wikipedia. It's classified as digitally dead by Andras Kornai, and it has still very few resources that have been put towards machine translation. Mandinka also has official status in Senegal and Gambia. Many may be familiar with the language from the book Roots. It's not endangered. It has millions of speakers, and it's still quite widely used and developing as a language. So it's not near extinction. However, it's a primarily oral language. And so it really has very few written resources in the digital sphere. And that really makes it, puts it at a disadvantage for machine translation. Last, I'll touch on Amharic, which has been a research focus for me. It's a national language of Ethiopia with 32 million speakers. It's benefited from early efforts by digital pioneers who pushed forward Unicode encoding, making it the first African script encoded in Unicode, as well as building software, word processors, etc. And there is an active NLP community, but nonetheless, it's still considered a low resource language at this point. And we can see down here, a Google Translate example where Professor, you are the best is translated in a way that assumes that the professor is male and doesn't use the respectful tone. So we note that there is a risk also with these systems, even if they exist, to not respect, to one, have bias, but also not to respect the cultural norms of a language. And this is concerning for, again, younger generations who are learning from these tools. So what are some of the challenges when it comes to machine translation? Well, one is that when we're trying to cover all the world's languages, we see many differences in grammatical structures. We have history of language oppression of various forms, and this has also meant that there's not a lot of written materials or a lot of materials online in many languages, which leads to a lack of corpora or data sets to build our machine translations tools. And sometimes those materials that do exist are not the most accurate of the language and the cultures there. We also see a lack of basic digital supports in the full stack, such as Unicode, keyboard, or fonts also impedes the development of user-generated online corpora. And then last, we see cultural community disconnect with forms like Wikipedia and the first player advantage of dominant languages such as English mean that for many people who are bilingual, they use English or another dominant language to find information and share information rather than using their mother tongue. So especially neural machine translation requires large data sets and large processing power. And unfortunately, this is only available to wealthy institutions, be they corporations or universities. We also see a lack of NLP skills within digitally disadvantaged language communities. And we see a lack of funding for digital language equity initiatives. We also see a lack of focus on digitally disadvantaged languages within major NLP research centers, other than those of strategic interest to military and intelligence. So therefore, we see, unfortunately, a disconnect between NLP researchers and language communities. Now, on the other hand, we do see promise. One is that a few individuals can make a difference. A single person or a small group of advocates have been able to develop a baseline of digital support for a language, and Amharic is a good example. Collective efforts such as Masakane are bringing a sea change in African language NLP, and they have NLP researchers working across a wide range of languages, many of them working on their own mother tongues and supporting one another and developing the knowledge to do that. And much of their work is open source and often feeds into corporate systems such as Google and others. If basic digital supports exist and digital language use is emerging, there is a chance to develop language corpora. And here I show a clip from Indigenous Tweets, which documents some of the tweets that are happening in some of the most digitally disadvantaged languages. And these tweets can actually turn into a corpora that could be used within a machine translation system. Furthermore, neural machine translation, or these AI systems, demonstrate that we can transfer learning about high resource languages onto low resources languages. And this is more effective when the languages are similar, and there are commonalities. So there is some promise with these new systems that we may not need large corpora to build machine translation systems. So we see some utopian visions being presented, right? We see arguments that simultaneous, universal, ubiquitous translation systems could support language diversity, including a recent promise to make instantaneous machine translation in hundreds of languages a reality in the metaverse. And we're wondering, can Facebook deliver? They've promised before to bring the world together. They haven't always delivered to do that in a safe and healthy way for people. So we're not sure yet whether this will actually become a reality. We have to be careful about buying into the rhetoric. We hope that digital translation could potentially close the digital divide of information access and expression, preserve the safety of translators in conflict situations, get critical info to people affected by health crises, and facilitate regional harmony, trade, etc. That would be our utopian goals. But there are potential perils. Digitally disadvantaged languages may go extinct before the promise of machine translation arrives. Furthermore, not all language communities want machine translation. Its development can be compared to colonial extraction of languages. In some cases, communities do not want to be part of the digital surveillance capitalist ecosystem. Furthermore, translation quality may be poor. As we saw with the example for Amharic, there are many of these languages that are being added to these systems where actually the translation quality is not high. And this can have actually a feedback loop that degrades the quality of the language over time because of these neural machine translation systems that continue to build on corpora that are developed through these same systems. And this can create bias within automated practices, such as content moderation that's done through AI. And so we worry that people's, their free expression may be limited, or maybe toxic content may not be moderated because AI systems are not able to accurately deal with digitally disadvantaged language. And there's always the potential that poor translation can actually exacerbate conflict in the digital sphere. So we also worry that machine translation can make language more legible to surveillance, be it corporate, government, NGOs, or other actors. We know that, for example, on the US border with Mexico, border agents can use social media posts, which they translate through Google Translate, to decide cases of asylum. And so whether these tools are accurate can have very severe consequences for the people whose lives are affected. And my concern is that this will particularly impact minority, indigenous, migrant, and activist communities who are at odds with corporations, governments, or third-party actors, and who have limited resources to protect themselves. So we see that these technologies can be a double-edged sword that may actually reinforce systems of oppression afflicting digitally disadvantaged language communities as much as they may open up access. So I hope I've clarified how these three categories impact language justice in the digital sphere, and how machine translation is shaped by power, how these systems affect speaker communities, the challenges, promise, and perils of machine translation for speaker communities. So I hope I've left you thinking about what would language justice in the digital sphere look like, and what can we do to achieve it. Thank you very much.